The year is 1882. The place, a stretch of land so isolated in the rolling hills of Kentucky that the modern world felt like a distant, irrelevant whisper. We are not in a town nor even a village. We are by the banks of the Crooked Creek, a ribbon of cold, dark water cutting through the deepest, most unforgiving woods of Laurel County. The air here, even in the heart of summer, felt heavy, weighted with the silence of ancient trees and secrets the earth had chosen not to yield. It is here that we begin, not with a crime already committed, but with the slow, creeping discovery of an impossible shared violation that would forever stain the local folklore. The macabre details of the Crooked Creek affair were, for decades, banned from polite conversation, whispered only in the shadows of firelight, a story too disturbing, too fundamentally wrong to be given the light of day. But its central, horrifying truth remains. A small, deeply religious and profoundly isolated family, the Athertons, housed 5 daughters, and within the span of one cruel 4-month winter, all 5 of them, from the eldest at 21 down to the youngest, barely 14, were discovered to be pregnant. Not by local suitors, not by traveling men passing through, but by the same, chillingly unknown hand. This is the cold case of the silent daughters of the Creek, a chronicle of escalating dread, and a mystery that still haunts the deep Kentucky hills. The first sign, the first shift in the Atherton household's oppressive silence, came not from the girls, who were taught from birth to be seen and not heard, but from the changing shape of a dress, the deepening pallor of a face. The patriarch, Elias Atherton, was a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the hills he farmed. He was a primitive Baptist, strict to the point of cruelty, a man who saw the world through the narrow lens of biblical punishment and divine retribution. His wife, Elara, was a woman worn down by hard labor and constant fear, her spirit long since crushed into submission. Their home was not a sanctuary, but a compound of fear, where silence was the only acceptable expression. The 5 daughters, Martha, Clara, Beatrice, Lyra, and the youngest, Abigail, were known collectively by the few neighbors scattered across the vast, lonely county simply as the Silent Daughters. They moved through their days like ghosts, eyes lowered, voices barely a rustle. This rigid control is what makes the forthcoming discovery so jarring, so profoundly destabilizing to the entire social fabric of the area. When Elias first noticed the telltale changes in Martha, the eldest, his reaction wasn't concern but white-hot, righteous fury. He dragged her to the nearest preacher, miles away, demanding an immediate and public confession of the sin he assumed was hers alone. But Martha, through silent tears, could offer no name. She could only shake her head, a denial that Elias interpreted as profound defiance. He locked her away in the small, root cellar beneath the cabin, believing that shame and isolation would force the truth from her. He was certain it was a singular act of forbidden lust. He was tragically, horrifyingly wrong. The macabre discovery of Martha's condition was only the opening note in a dissonant, horrifying symphony. Barely a week later, the same unmistakable signs presented themselves in Clara, the second daughter. Clara was 16, shy, and possessed a quiet intensity that often drew Elia's suspicious gaze. When confronted, Clara mirrored her sister's response, silent denial of an identifiable perpetrator. The very idea that 2 unmarried girls from the same household, under the same roof, could fall to the same sin without detection was already stretching the limits of Elia's severely limited worldview. He refused to believe it was possible without a deliberate, outside corruption, perhaps even a demonic influence. The community, what little of it there was, began to recoil. The Athertons, always isolated, now found themselves utterly shunned. Whispers of a curse began to circulate among the log cabins and dusty roads. Was it the land? Was it Elia's overzealous piety finally inviting retribution? This was 1882. The age of reason had not yet fully penetrated the deepest, darkest corners of the American frontier, and superstition held a powerful, suffocating grip. But the pattern was far from complete. The slow-burn suspense was only just igniting. The third discovery, that of Beatrice, came only 2 months after Martha's initial confrontation. 3 daughters now, all showing the same signs of imminent motherhood, all maintaining the same chilling, unbroken silence regarding the father. This is the moment the rational mind breaks. The sheer statistical improbability of 3 separate acts, concealed so perfectly, committed by 3 different, unrelated men. It defied common sense, even the fractured common sense of the rural 19th century. This realization shifted the narrative from simple immorality to something deeply disturbing, something with the cold, deliberate precision of a single, unseen hunter. Elia's fury had curdled into a cold, profound dread. He stopped beating the girls. He stopped demanding confession. He simply watched them, his eyes hollowed with a fear that went beyond social disgrace. He locked the doors at dusk, barred the windows, and slept with a shotgun across his chest, convinced that whatever entity was violating his family was either supernatural or an invisible, omnipresent local predator. The daughters themselves remained an enigma, moving like automatons, their silence now a shield, a wall no one could penetrate. They would not speak of the man. They would not speak of the act. The cold case was now one of shared, impenetrable trauma. The creeping dread became total, inescapable panic when Lyra and little Abigail, the 2 youngest, were also confirmed to be pregnant in quick succession. 5 daughters, 5 pregnancies, all discovered within a 4-month window of the Kentucky winter. The implication was as simple as it was horrifying: a single predator. But how? How could one man in one single, isolated farmhouse repeatedly violate 5 different girls, of drastically different ages, over a period of months, without a trace of entry, without a sound, without a single witness to offer his description? The family's isolation, meant to be their protection against the sinful world, had become their cage. Elias, broken and terrified, finally did what he should have done months ago. He rode into the county seat and alerted the local sheriff, a man named Deputy Sheriff Harlan Calloway, who usually spent his days dealing with stray livestock and drunken brawls. Calloway arrived at the Atherton farm prepared for a domestic dispute, perhaps a lone barn worker gone rogue. What he found was a scene of macabre, total devastation, a chilling riddle laid bare in the heart of the woods. This is where the historical record takes its deep, dark turn. If you found yourself gripped by the unseen hand closing around this family, you understand the magnetic pull of truly banned histories. If you want to hear more forbidden stories of secrets and escalating dread, subscribe now and ring that notification bell. Because what follows is even darker, as Deputy Calloway begins to unearth what the silent daughters refuse to speak. Deputy Calloway was a practical man, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen his share of disturbing acts, but the sight of the Atherton girls, 5 pale, silent figures lined up against a cold stone fireplace, shook him to his core. He interviewed Elias first, a rambling, broken narrative of a curse and divine anger, useless for police work. He then tried the mother, Alara, who could only weep, repeating that it was the same shadow. Finally, he turned to the daughters, one by one. Martha, the eldest, simply stared at the floor, unresponsive to questions about a face, a voice, a struggle. Clara was catatonic, only shaking her head. Beatrice seemed to know something, a deep secret held behind fearful eyes, but when Calloway pressed her, she simply collapsed into silent, trembling hysteria. Lyra, only 15, had a fever and was delirious, muttering phrases that made no sense. The cold hands, the song. But it was the youngest, Abigail, barely a child, who offered the single chilling detail. When Calloway asked her to describe the man, she whispered a name. Not a name of a local or a relative or a known drifter. She whispered a name that shouldn't have been known to her, a name that belonged to the Crooked Creek itself. Old Man Silas. The name Old Man Silas was not merely the name of a person. It was a piece of local folklore, a boogeyman, a figure whispered by mothers to keep children from straying too close to the deepest parts of the woods bordering the creek. Silas, according to the local, sparsely populated history, was a hermit, a Native American recluse, or perhaps a runaway slave. The details were always vague. who had vanished into the dense, dark thicket decades ago and was believed to have died there, his spirit left to guard the forbidden grounds near the old, abandoned Salt Lick. The area was notoriously dangerous, filled with sinkholes and tangled undergrowth. For Abigail, the youngest daughter, to name this ghost of the woods immediately led Calloway to believe the child was either lying to deflect punishment or was truly confused. The possibility that a living man, a real flesh and blood perpetrator, was invoking an old legend to terrify his victims was the only rational path. However, the subsequent investigation, which began with a slow, meticulous search of the creek banks, turned up no footprints, no sign of a camp, no discarded clothing, nothing to suggest a man had been living secretly nearby. The cold case was developing an almost supernatural, macabre quality that unnerved the deputy. Calloway, resisting the growing tide of local superstition that the Athertons were afflicted by a curse, focused his investigation on the house itself. The windows were small, latched from the inside, and the only two doors were heavily barred by Elias every night. How could a single man repeatedly gain access to a farmhouse under the eyes of a paranoid shotgun-wielding patriarch? The deputy meticulously inspected every inch of the structure. He found no forced entry, no broken panes, no secret tunnels. The only unusual detail was a small, crudely fashioned crawl space leading beneath the house, used primarily for storage of potatoes and salted meats. This crawl space, accessible from a removable floorboard in the corner of the pantry, led to the earthen foundation. It was disturbingly low and dark, and Calloway had to lie on his stomach to pass through. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of earth and something else, something musty, metallic, and profoundly unsettling. It was there, in the pitch black, that he made his second significant discovery, a detail that deepened the mystery and heightened the escalating dread. Deep beneath the floorboards, carefully concealed beneath a mound of dry earth and old sacking, Calloway found three things. First, a small, worn leather pouch containing a handful of smooth, river-polished stones, the kind you would find at the bottom of the crooked creek. Second, a crudely carved wooden whistle shaped like a small bird. And third, a length of heavy, braided horsehair rope knotted at one end. None of these items were inherently criminal, yet their presence beneath a heavily secured house, hidden from the family, felt profoundly horrifying. The river stones suggested a connection to the water, the whistle a silent means of communication or perhaps a lure, and the rope. The rope spoke of restraint or perhaps a means of ascent or descent. Calloway deduced that the crawl space must have been the point of entry and exit. But how? The access point was only from inside the pantry, meaning the perpetrator had to somehow get inside the house first. This led to a disturbing realization. The violation had to be an inside job, or the intruder had a key, or most chillingly, had been granted access by one of the silent daughters themselves. The cold case of the Crooked Creek now pivoted from an external haunting to an internal betrayal, a secret conspiracy of silence among the 5 victims. The deputy's next logical step was to interrogate the only other member of the Atherton household, Elias and Alara's son, Jesse, a quiet 19-year-old boy. Jesse was a non-factor in the house, a shadow much like his sisters who spent his days doing heavy labor in the fields. Calloway had initially dismissed him, assuming a brother would not inflict such shared, macabre trauma on his own sisters. But the evidence, the internal access point, the single predator, forced a re-evaluation. Calloway brought Jesse in for questioning, separating him from the oppressive silence of the family farm. Jesse was utterly bewildered, nearly fainting at the accusation. His terror seemed genuine, his denial absolute. He provided a solid alibi for the majority of the period. He had been working on a distant, relative's farm a day's ride away, a detail easily verified by the relative, who testified that Jesse had not been home for stretches of 2 to 3 weeks at a time. This removed the most obvious and least disturbing suspect. The search for the single, unseen hand was back to square one, but with a terrifying amendment. The perpetrator was not a family member, yet he had access. The curse seemed to be tightening its grip on the truth. With Jesse eliminated, Calloway began to look again at the father, Elias. Could the pious patriarch be hiding a horrifying double life? Could the religious fervor be a cover for an internal serial violation? The macabre scenario was plausible, fitting the single predator pattern. Calloway had seen men crack under pressure before. He pressed Elias hard, pointing out the impossibility of an outside intruder. Elias, however, did not break. He did not confess. Instead, he simply looked at the deputy with eyes full of a genuine, profound, and devastating fear, repeating the same desolate claim. "It wasn't me, deputy. I wish to God it was, but it wasn't me. It's the shadow, the thing under the house." Elias then revealed a forbidden family secret, a detail that had been carefully hidden from the community, a detail he believed was the true source of the family's curse. The Athertons were not the first family to settle this particular, isolated stretch of Crooked Creek. An older, darker history haunted the land. Elias revealed that years before they purchased the land, the previous occupants had abruptly vanished without a trace. They were the Millers, a family of 4 who had simply left their dinner half-eaten on the table, their livestock unattended, their doors ajar. The community at the time had assumed they simply fled in the night, perhaps to escape debt or the harshness of the frontier. But Elias, in his terror, believed they were taken by the thing that dwelled by the creek. He told Calloway that shortly after they moved into the house, Ilara, his wife, had found a small clay doll buried beneath the large ancient sycamore tree in their front yard. The doll was crudely fashioned, with 6 holes where the eyes and mouth should have been, and its neck was wrapped with a piece of braided horsehair, an exact match for the rope Calloway had found in the crawl space. This sudden revelation of a deep, dark historical precedent, a similar disappearance, a macabre token, was the turning point. It shifted the cold case from a crime of passion to a potential serial haunting, a terrifying, cyclical event tied to the very land itself. The deputy, though a rational man of the law, could not completely dismiss the power of local superstition, especially when evidence, like the matching horsehair, began to confirm the folklore. He decided to revisit the initial source of the disturbance, the Silent Daughters. This time, he didn't ask for a name or a description. He asked them about the whistle. He asked them about the river stones. And most disturbingly, he asked them about the smell, the musty, metallic smell he had detected in the crawl space. It was Clara, the second daughter, who finally broke the profound silence. Her voice was barely audible, a weak, frightened whisper. "He gave us the stones, deputy," she murmured, eyes still fixed on the floor. "He said they had magic in them from the running water. He said they would keep us safe from Papa's anger." When Calloway asked her about the smell, she just shivered. The cold. The smell of the forbidden mud. He smelled like the creek. If you're still with us, you've proven you have the stomach for history's darkest, most horrifying secrets. We're about to dive into the mind of the predator and finally piece together his twisted, banned methods. Before we do, hit that like button to help this story reach more people who crave the truth behind the macabre. The climax is approaching, and the identity of Old Man Silas will shock you. The collective confession that the man had given them tokens and offered a twisted form of comfort painted a macabre psychological picture. The perpetrator was not a violent rapist breaking down the door. He was a manipulator, exploiting the girls' profound isolation and fear of their own father. The Atherton house, for all its strict piety, was a psychological pressure cooker, and the girls, deprived of affection and freedom, were incredibly vulnerable. The man understood the internal dynamics of the house perfectly. He was their silent confidant, their disturbing protector. The revelation that the man used the river stones as magic was especially telling of his technique, preying on the young, superstitious minds of the frontier. This confirmed Calloway's theory. The girls were allowing him inside. But how did he know when to come? How did he coordinate 5 separate months-long visits with 5 different girls, all while the house was supposedly locked down? The answer, Calloway suspected, lay in the little bird whistle. The bird whistle found in the crawl space was examined by a local woodworker, who confirmed it was crafted from a native laurel wood, common in the area, but uniquely shaped to mimic the specific, high-pitched call of a rare, nocturnal bird. Calloway hypothesized that the man was communicating with the girls from outside, signaling his arrival when the lights were out, and Elias was deep in his exhausted sleep. The girls, conditioned by fear, would then use the internal pantry floorboard to allow him access to the crawl space, where he would wait, hidden in the macabre darkness until the right moment. This answered the how, but not the who. The girls' persistent refusal to name a real person, their insistence on the spectral old man Silas, was the final, profound hurdle. Calloway knew he needed to find the man's lair, the source of his unsettling knowledge of the family's routine. He decided to follow the only concrete lead he had, the Crooked Creek itself, and the legend of the vanished settlers, the Millers. Calloway, accompanied by a small team of local woodsmen, who were themselves deeply unnerved by the talk of a curse, began a grid search along the most remote, overgrown sections of the Crooked Creek. The area was treacherous, riddled with hidden ravines and almost impossible to navigate without local knowledge. They searched for days, finding nothing but cold water and endless dark foliage. The woodsmen were convinced they were wasting their time, that old man Silas was a ghost. Then on the third day, miles from the Atherton farm, deep in a ravine near where the river twisted into a shallow, rocky gorge, one of the men stumbled upon a faint, almost invisible trail. It led not toward the creek, but upward to a narrow, nearly vertical fissure in a towering limestone bluff, a natural cave system, almost entirely forbidden to sunlight. The entrance to the cave was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, masked by thick, hanging moss and an overgrowth of poison ivy. Inside, the darkness was absolute, the air immediately heavy with the same musty, metallic smell Calloway had detected beneath the Atherton house. Calloway and the woodsmen proceeded with extreme caution, carrying lanterns that cast dancing, disturbing shadows on the damp walls. The cave descended into the earth, opening up into a series of larger cathedral-like chambers, damp and cold. This was not just a temporary hiding place. It was a permanent dwelling, a meticulously arranged, macabre home in the earth. The centerpiece of the main chamber was a crudely built bed of woven reeds, covered by several animal hides, near a small, perpetually smoldering fire pit, vented through a nearly invisible crack in the ceiling. The floor was strewn with bones, gnawed clean, mostly small game, but Calloway noticed a few larger, human-sized fragments that made his blood run cold. The sheer, horrifying labor involved in turning this cave into a habitable dwelling spoke of years, perhaps decades, of occupation. On a small, flat slab of rock near the fire, Calloway found the man's personal effects. There was a stack of crudely drawn pictures, renderings of 5 young girls, all with exaggerated, fearful eyes, drawn in charcoal on birch bark. This was his gallery of the Silent Daughters. Next to the drawings was a collection of other macabre items. A small, tattered diary written in a barely legible hand, a piece of worn cloth that Calloway immediately recognized as being part of a blanket from the Atherton house, and a collection of handmade fishing lures, intricately carved. But the most disturbing find was a collection of braided horsehair ropes, dozens of them, hanging neatly from a protrusion in the rock, all exactly the same type as the one found under the house, and the one described in Elia's unsettling tale of the clay doll. The repetition of the horsehair was a dark, ritualistic signature. The diary, though difficult to decipher, offered a chilling look into the mind of the predator. It was not a tale of lust, but a paranoid narrative of ownership and spiritual control. The writer believed he was the rightful master of the creek, the only one capable of protecting the land's secrets. He referred to the Athertons, and chillingly, the vanished Millers before them, not as people, but as gifts from the water to be harvested and controlled. He wrote of the girls as my silent daughters, whom he was saving from their father's false god. The diary made clear that he believed his acts were not sins, but a divine, macabre duty. The sheer arrogance and profound mental detachment detailed in the cramped script escalated the case from a simple crime to a matter of truly disturbing psychological horror. Calloway was now dealing with a deeply deranged, yet terrifyingly methodical, serial predator. The diary also contained the final, most crucial clue. In the diary's final entry, written only a week before Calloway found the cave, the man wrote of his plan to take the youngest, the purest one to the old place, before the coming snow. He referred to the place only as the old place, marking it with a crudely drawn map showing the confluence of the Crooked Creek and a smaller, tributary stream known locally as Widow's Run. This location was notoriously remote, marked by a massive, ancient, split oak tree that had been struck by lightning years ago, a landmark that locals typically avoided, believing it held a curse. Calloway immediately understood the horrifying meaning. The perpetrator was planning to take Abigail, the youngest daughter, who was already confirmed pregnant, and disappear completely, likely taking her to a remote cabin or shelter he had built long ago. The manhunt, which had been a quiet, discreet affair, instantly became a race against time, a desperate search for the most vulnerable of the silent daughters. Calloway and his team moved with a speed born of panic and escalating dread toward the Widow's Run area. The terrain was even more difficult than the creek banks, forcing them to dismount and proceed on foot, battling through thickets and scrambling over slick, moss-covered rocks. The woods were unnervingly silent, the only sound the crunching of their boots and their own heavy breathing. As they approached the landmark, the massive split oak, they noticed something profoundly disturbing, a faint wisp of smoke rising from a chimney, almost invisible against the gray winter sky. Hidden deep beneath a canopy of dense pine, a small, half-rotted log cabin stood. It was so perfectly concealed it could have been there for 50 years and gone unnoticed by everyone but the man who built it. The forbidden lair was found, but Calloway did not know what horrors awaited him inside. Creeping toward the cabin, Calloway could hear the low, rhythmic sound of a man humming, a strange, discordant tune that sounded like a half-forgotten lullaby. Peeking through a crack in the warped logs, he saw him. The man was sitting on a low stool by a tiny fireplace, carving a piece of wood. The flickering firelight illuminated his face. He was old, incredibly gaunt, with long, wild white hair and a matted gray beard, a man who looked exactly like the folk legend Old Man Silas. And next to him, curled up on a thin mat, was Abigail, the youngest of the silent daughters. She was awake but completely unresponsive, staring blankly at the far wall. The scene was one of macabre, devastating tranquility, the very definition of a predator's calculated control. Calloway, recognizing the man from the detailed description of a vanished local eccentric who had been presumed dead 2 decades prior, burst through the cabin door, shotgun raised. The confrontation was immediate and chaotic. The man, startled, did not run. Instead, he lunged at Calloway with the carving knife, screaming in a high, thin voice that this was his daughter, his harvest, forbidden by the light. Calloway managed to sidestep the attack, bringing the butt of the shotgun down hard across the man's temple. The man collapsed instantly, the carving knife clattering harmlessly to the dirt floor. As Calloway secured the man with the heavy horsehair rope he carried from the cave, he looked at Abigail. The girl, still catatonic, did not react to the noise, the violence, or even the sight of Calloway. Her emotional and physical distance was a terrifying measure of the horrifying control the man had achieved. The man was identified as Jedediah Crone, a local recluse who had indeed been officially declared dead after an apparent drowning 22 years earlier. Around the exact time, the Miller family had vanished. Crone, a strange and deeply disturbing man even in his youth, was a master trapper and woodsman who knew every secret path and hidden cave in Laurel County. He had simply faked his death, using his knowledge of the creek to create a new, dark, isolated existence as the living, macabre embodiment of the Old Man Sila's legend. The revelation of his true identity finally allowed Calloway to close the loop on the cold case, but the emotional and historical devastation remained. Crone had been living in the caves and hidden cabins for over 2 decades, venturing out only to observe, to trap, and it was now clear to prey on the most vulnerable families of the creek. The interrogation of Jedediah Crone was a study in pure, unadulterated madness. He was lucid, yet profoundly delusional, maintaining that the 5 silent daughters were not victims, but his true family, seeded by the spirit of the running water. He confessed to meticulously studying the Atherton family for months, observing their routines, their fears, and Elia's brutal piety, which he used as his psychological lever. He admitted to creating the bird whistle himself, using its unique call to signal to the girls that Papa was asleep, and the coast was clear. The girls, conditioned by his twisted promises of protection and magic stones against their father's wrath, would then grant him access to the crawl space. This confirmed Calloway's most disturbing theory. The girls were not taken by force, but psychologically lured into their own long, shared violation. Crone also readily confessed to the details of the Miller family's disappearance 22 years prior. They were, he claimed, his first unworthy gift from the creek. He didn't kill them violently. He simply convinced them they were living under a curse, and that the only way to be saved was to vanish and start a new life with him in the woods. When they realized his true intentions, they resisted, and he sealed them in one of the deeper, rarely accessible sections of the cave system, where they eventually starved. He considered their bodies to be a macabre offering to the earth. He had even kept some of their clothing and personal effects, which Calloway later recovered from the cave, finally providing closure to a 2-decade-old mystery that had been dismissed as a simple flight. The terror was cyclical, a dark pattern of control and exploitation rooted in the landscape. The trial of Jedediah Crone was a sensational, short-lived affair that the local authorities attempted to keep quiet, fearing the details would plunge the already superstitious county into complete chaos. The full horrifying scope of his macabre acts, the psychological manipulation, the years of isolated living, the ritualistic tokens, was deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The judge, convinced of Crone's profound insanity and the overwhelming evidence, sentenced him to be institutionalized in the newly built asylum in eastern Kentucky, a place designed to house the region's most violently deranged criminals. The community, however, refused to believe that one man, even a madman, could inflict such a shared curse on 5 separate women. The official narrative was simple: a crazed hermit and his crimes. The local whispers were much darker. The fate of the silent daughters became the true, lingering tragedy of the cold case. They were victims twice over, once by the predator and again by their own community. The girls, now confirmed pregnant by a madman, were seen not as survivors, but as carriers of a forbidden stain. Their father, Elias, could not live with the shame, and the terror of realizing his own cruelty had created the psychological conditions for Crone's success. He took his own life barely a month after the trial, hanging himself from the very sycamore tree where Ilara had found the clay doll years before. The mother, Ilara, was left completely broken, fleeing the Crooked Creek farm and vanishing into the vastness of Kentucky, never to be heard from again. The farm, the house of shared trauma, stood abandoned, a macabre monument to silence and dread. As for the daughters, their silence remained unbroken even after Crone was confined. They refused to speak of the man, the axe, or the children they now carried. The 5 girls were taken in by a distant, philanthropic relative in a different state, who tried to integrate them back into normal life. But the scars were too deep. All 5 children were eventually born healthy, but all 5 bore a striking, disturbing resemblance to Jedediah Crone: the same unusual shape of the eyes, the same unnaturally white hair at birth. The Bobbies were all immediately given up for adoption, their bloodline forever tainted by the madness of Old Man Silas. The silent daughters themselves eventually scattered, each carrying the horrifying secret of the creek, never marrying, never speaking of their shared macabre experience again. The narrative of the Crooked Creek case was deliberately rewritten by the authorities. The full, disturbing details of the psychological grooming, the internal access, and the horsehair rituals were largely suppressed, deemed too unsettling for the public record. Crone's banned diary was destroyed, and the Miller family's remains were quietly interred without ceremony. The goal was to quell the rising tide of local superstition and restore a sense of order. Yet the facts of the case, too dark to be completely erased, seeped into the local folklore. The Atherton farm remained a place of curse, the creek itself a symbol of an invisible, constant threat. Even decades later, locals would not camp near the split oak, and the name Old Man Sila's became the permanent, macabre fixture in the region's unwritten history. The most profound aspect of the cold case is the enduring enigma of the girl's silence. Why did 5 girls, of varying ages and personalities, never once break their silence, even when they knew their father was punishing them for an act they shared? The psychological consensus among the few doctors who briefly examined them was shared trauma and Stockholm Syndrome, a terrifying collective loyalty to their predator, who, in their deeply warped reality, had offered them affection and freedom their own father denied them. Crone was the only person who spoke to them as individuals, the only one who offered them tokens and secrets. His macabre control was total, a fortress built on the foundation of their father's brutality. Their silence was their bond, their final, forbidden act of defiance against a world that had betrayed them. In a final, chilling postscript to the affair, Jedediah Crone, the self-proclaimed master of the creek, died in the asylum after only 3 years. His death was ruled natural, but the records indicated he never stopped humming the discordant lullaby Calloway had heard that day in the remote cabin. Before he died, he managed to scrawl one final, disturbing message on the wall of his cell using his own blood. It was a single macabre sentence. The creek still runs and the silence is not broken. The daughters remember their father. This final, cryptic message implied that his connection to the girls, his psychological hold, endured even through his confinement and beyond his death. The fear he instilled was a legacy, a curse passed down through the silence. The story of the silent daughters of the creek remains one of history's most unnerving examples of sustained, isolated psychological terror. It is a chronicle of how absolute power, even in the smallest, most remote setting, can corrupt absolutely, turning victims into silent co-conspirators in their own horrifying violation. The isolation of the Kentucky hills, the profound religious rigidity of the father, the ancient folklore of the land, all combined to create the perfect, forbidden hunting ground for a methodical madman. The cold, dark water of the Crooked Creek still flows today, a silent, macabre witness to the events of 1882, a constant reminder that sometimes the deepest, most disturbing secrets are not hidden in the earth, but are of the earth. The true ending to this macabre tale is not the arrest, the trial, or even the institutionalization of the man they called Old Man Sila's. It is the echo of the silence he left behind. The 5 daughters, separated and scattered, never reconciled, never spoke to a soul about their shared violation. The children, raised in separate homes, grew up never knowing their origin, yet unknowingly carrying the DNA and the macabre shadow of the hermit of the creek. Every time the wind blows a certain way through the laurel woods of Laurel County, every time the water of the Crooked Creek runs dark and cold after a heavy rain, the whispers of the curse return. The Atherton farmhouse eventually rotted, a total ruin, its timbers reclaimed by the earth. But the feeling of escalating dread, of a secret shared but never spoken, remains. The story is a banned history for a reason. It reminds us that the most disturbing evil can wear the mask of a ghost, live among us, and use our deepest fears to forge its chains. The ultimate macabre twist of the Crooked Creek affair is this. Jedediah Crone, the perpetrator, was apprehended and held accountable, yet he ultimately succeeded in achieving his goal. He successfully destroyed the Atherton family, claimed 5 victims, and left behind a legacy of silence and psychological devastation that outlived him and shattered a family across generations. The story, now a piece of dark, rural legend, continues to be an uncomfortable testament to the power of a forbidden secret and the corrosive effect of profound isolation. The silent daughters gave birth to the silent children of the creek, and the memory of the cold hands and the metallic smell remains buried beneath the dense woods of Kentucky. The cold case is closed, the man is dead, but the dread lingers, a testament to the fact that some secrets are never meant to be fully revealed, and some silences are forever unbroken. And as the dark water of the creek continues its endless, winding journey, one can only wonder, are there other silent daughters in other remote corners of the world, unknowingly guarding their own horrifying secrets? The question is as unsettling as the chilling, quiet depths of the crooked creek itself.